I want to start my talk with a phrase. It goes like this: what happens over there affects us here. And after September 11, 2001, sometimes we heard a corollary to this, which is we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here. And now, so many years after 9/11, I'd like to postulate that it may have been the opposite lesson that we should have learned. You heard about Dr. Ahmed al-Modi. You know he's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded the American Muslim Council. He's the Islamic advisor to the Clinton White House. He worked with Sami al-Aran, another MB member who Steve didn't mention, but he would eventually go to jail for working for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Steve mentioned how al-Modi founded that mosque up in Boston and how the Tsarnaev brothers were radicalized there. Word we're not supposed to use, but that's the word that's in common parlance. And it took Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas to inform the director of the FBI that a known Al-Qaeda financier set up the mosque that these two gentlemen went to. And apparently, the director of the FBI did not know that. And Gohmert asked him, he said, "Have your agents ever been to this mosque? Were you aware of this mosque?" And the FBI director says, "Yes, we did outreach there." In 2007, federal prosecutors filed charges against the Holy Land Foundation, Texas-based Muslim charity front group for terror groups Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. During the trial, the prosecutors released hundreds of documents about the Muslim Brotherhood, entire archives of the North American Muslim Brotherhood. Names, phone numbers, organizations, a full strategic memorandum that Steve wrote basically the book on. We had their entire game plan, right? We had guys in the dock. And after an initial mistrial, the federal government won their case in November of 2008. And then what happens? Nothing happens. The exposed agents of the Grand Jihad, they don't run for cover when the lights come on. With a few exceptions, their government contacts don't cut them off, even though they're thoroughly tainted with terrorist connections, even though they're signed on to a seditious conspiracy against the United States. The secondary prosecutions, which were supposed to follow the Holy Land Foundation case, are scuttled to avoid political embarrassment. Major news organizations, never talked about this, continue to go to members of the known Muslim Brotherhood and ask them their opinion about all things Islam, including what they should think about the Muslim Brotherhood. The FBI still does outreach with Brotherhood groups. DoD chaplains still trained by Brotherhood groups. Nadal Hassan yells Allahu Akbar, describes himself as a soldier of Allah. It's listed as workplace violence, even though he's in direct communication with AQ leader al-Awlaki, who himself, by the way, was once an honored guest at the Pentagon and right here on Capitol Hill. And as Steve mentioned before his departure, al-Awlaki's an imam of the Dar al-Hijra Mosque, which is a who's who of Muslim Brotherhood groups that found that mosque and are on their board. Al-Awlaki, al-Modi, these men didn't go over there to fight with Al-Qaeda. They were fighting here. Their job was here. And so that's why I said, fight them here so we don't have to fight them there. Another case in point, Louis Safi, whose sordid career includes the Islamic Society of North America, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. Shortly after Nadal Hassan's rampage, Louis Safi goes down to Fort Hood in order to provide them with a diversity presentation on how they should think about Islam. And then shortly after that, he's let go from the Pentagon because of his terror connections. Where is he now? He's the chief political officer for the Syrian opposition. He transitioned seamlessly from his job at the Pentagon to his job over there for the Syrian rebels. The ones that we're pretty sure are moderate. There's little doubt, by the way, that Safi's connections in Washington paid off when Texas-based IT professional Ghassan Hito is elected to become the interim prime minister for the Syrian opposition. Hito was eventually forced to resign thanks to Saudi pressure, but it was with U.S. support that he was elected. And if that's not a strong indicator of the Muslim Brotherhood's influence within the Syrian rebels, then I don't know what is. Hito, by the way, served his time with Muslim Brotherhood groups too, including CARE while he was here. So he's over here, they do their work, and they can transition seamlessly into top positions over there. So we already know that the guys who represent the Syrian rebels in the suits and ties, they have terror connections. So how much more so the guys in the field with the guns yelling Allahu Akbar? What about Salah Sultan, who's formerly a member of the Muslim American Society, still a member of the International Union of Muslim Scholars? His son, who was president of the Ohio State University Muslim Students Association, got shot in a protest, a Muslim Brotherhood protest by the Egyptian army. The elder Sultan, now in Egypt, is openly described, even in the mainstream media, and I thought this was interesting, he's openly described as a Muslim Brotherhood figure, something that they had refused to do when our good friend Patrick Poole, the investigative reporter, wrote about it in Ohio. Of course, they continue to refuse to mention that the Muslim American Society, the Muslim Students Association, the International Union of Muslim Scholars are all MB-affiliated organizations. The second command of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, by the way, met with White House officials to talk about a number of issues, including Syria. Other terror alums who made their bones right here in the United States include Abu Marzouk, who provided the startup funds for the Holy Land Foundation, was a founding member of the Islamic Association of Palestine, which would later on go to become CARE. What's he doing now? Deputy chairman of Hamas's political bureau. So that's the point I'm trying to make, that in this war on terror, the enemy's best and brightest wasn't ever in some cave in Waziristan. They were right here. I think Steve has made the case for the MB and the AQ cooperating in the war on terror. And you can see that with Al-Amodi and al-Awlaki and how seamlessly they transition. And you can see it with Mohammed Badi when he declares jihad on Israel and America. And I want to point out that I think that this connection is becoming clearer to the American public. I think thanks to President Obama's 2009 Cairo speech and the subsequent events of Brotherhood's rise and fall in Egypt, that case is clear. When you have Egyptian protesters who hold up signs that say Obama supports terrorism, and they feature pictures of the U.S. ambassador shaking hands with the Brotherhood's supreme God, the very man who declared jihad on America. This man had no government office. This was not a secretary-to-secretary contact or an ambassador to government contact. This was the U.S. ambassador meeting with the head of an organization that had been outlawed for 8 years, that we know has terrorist connections. I think the public understands that, even if they don't understand some of the details. I think that's part of the reason why the support for a strike in Syria is so low. The last poll I saw was 63% of Americans oppose action in Syria. And I think the public recognizes from the Egyptian example and the Libyan example with Benghazi that when the U.S. has intervened, it has done so to the benefit of some really shady characters. Look at the folks who were guarding our embassy, or consulate, or annex, or whatever it was in Benghazi. February 17th Martyrs Brigade. They were an MB entity. When the time came, they faded away, just in time for an Al-Qaeda entity to show up and kill people and burn the place down. So we now have a public that has a better understanding of this than the government does. They have to, because U.S. policymakers who have access to better information, they've heard these great briefings from Steve for, 4, 5, 6 years now? A long time. 10 years. They've had this stuff for 10 years. And we're just getting it now in the public, and yet we understand it better than they do. I mean, they can't possibly understand it, because if they did, would they select Yusuf al-Qaradawi the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, to go to Afghanistan and negotiate on our behalf with the Taliban? But that's what they've done. So in conclusion, I want to stress that all these defeats that we've suffered in the war on terror, and if you think we haven't suffered defeats, if you think we're winning, I think you're fooling yourself. But these defeats aren't the responsibility of our armed forces and the brave work the men on the ground do. As Steve said, they can win as many tactical victories as they want. But if the enemy has shaped your overarching policy, then it's time to change course. Fight them here so we don't have to fight them there, or so if we fight them there, we can actually win. The question is, how do we do that? And we have to work with what we have. And I mean, if we had an executive branch, if we had an administration that was willing, there's a list of things that we could recommend. We could renew the secondary prosecutions in the Holy Land trial, strengthen security background checks, designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. There's plenty of evidence to do that. But there's no reason to believe that such changes are possible for the next 3 years. I mean, if you think that they are, you're fooling yourself. And for that matter, there's no reason to believe that the next administration would necessarily be any better. You would have to have a president who's strong enough to challenge his own bureaucracy and to alter or abolish pro-brotherhood policies that have been in place for more than 10 years now. And so I think it's worthwhile. We can focus on the executive branch, but then we're focusing on something we don't have the ability to access. We don't have the ability to control right now. So let's talk about what we could do right now. And one of the things I think we need to do right away is leveraging the expertise of people who really understand this threat, people like Steve, and get their information into the hands of the general public in a way that the public can understand. The high-level officials, as I said, they've been briefed on this and they've chosen not to deal with it, except, of course, to remove or marginalize guys like Steve. So we take our case to the public, which I think, as I said, is more receptive now than they have been in a long time because of these foreign policy events, because of events in Egypt, because of events in Syria, because of events in Benghazi. The American people can see that and understand it without having to get into the weeds about who founded what mosque and who raised money for what. So I'd like to have some hearings on those issues, the foreign policy issues, where we see MB involvement. Do a hearing on the torture and murder of Copts in Egypt by the Muslim Brotherhood, not by Al-Qaeda, by the Muslim Brotherhood that set up torture centers in mosques and conducted torture against both secular Muslim protesters and especially against Copts. Do a hearing on that. Get the Muslim Brotherhood's name attached to that. Look at the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. I read a piece that described a Muslim Brotherhood-linked militia in Syria that was kind enough to offer prisoners the choice between converting or dying, as opposed to, I guess, al-Nusra, which would have just killed them outright. Steve's going to correct my sharia here because they're actually obligated to offer you that choice, but between convert or pay the jizya or die.
For people in the book.
Yeah, this is various Syrian Christians, but this is an MD militia, and their name is right on there. So if we could have hearings about these kind of activities, you could make that connection to the public. You know, have a select committee on events in Benghazi. Especially if you could highlight the role played by this February 17th Martyrs Brigade. Who are these guys? Who selected them? Who made that decision that these are the guys we want with guns to surround our ambassador? Raise that question. And all of these issues that I'm mentioning, they all come back to the same question, which is, how did the U.S. government end up in bed with these guys? Because unless people are prepared to ask that question, then they're not going to be receptive to the answer. You can't provide people with the answer until you've got them to ask the question. And I think, as I said, that these foreign policy events gives us the opportunity to have the public ask the question. So, without building a broad consensus among the public that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a moderate, is not an ally, is not an opponent of Al-Qaeda, but is an enemy of the United States, then you will never see an administration which has the power to take on their own bureaucracy. presidents have to have support among the people to challenge the ingrained bureaucracy. And sometimes they still lose. But with the power of the people behind them, they have the voting pulpit, they can usually take on their own departments and route things around troublemakers and get things done. Reagan did this in the Cold War, where there were institutions among states, CIA, and so forth, who were not prepared to challenge the Soviet Union in the way that he wanted to. And he built counter institutions, and he went around them, and he went directly to the American public and to world opinion. And I think we need a president that will do the same thing, but we have to lay the groundwork if we are going to get that.